Welcome to Artbeat again. I'm Jeffrey Brown. It's an unusual battle involving one of the world's leading musical instrument makers and the environmental laws intended to protect endangered species. In August, federal marshals raided the Gibson Guitar Corporation facilities in Nashville and Memphis. No charges have been filed yet, but a Justice Department spokesman said the government is looking at whether Gibson illegally imported wood from India, violating an environmental law known as the Lacey Act. 2 years ago, the feds conducted a similar raid against Gibson over wood allegedly imported from Madagascar. Gibson has denied any wrongdoing, and the story has become something of a hot-button political issue. Here to tell us more is Anita Wadhwani, who's covering the story in Nashville for the Tennessean. Welcome to you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Fill in the picture a bit for us. What does the government seem to be claiming that Gibson has done?
As you mentioned, there have actually been 2 raids on Gibson in the last 2 years, and in both cases, the government is claiming that Gibson has violated the Lacey Act, which is an environmental law designed to protect the imports of endangered wood products.
Tell us a little bit about Gibson. Of course, we know them as the famous guitar maker, so the idea is that they use the foreign wood for the products?
Gibson makes high-end guitars, acoustic and electric guitars, and part of the value of their instruments are some of these precious and rare hardwoods that they use to build the necks and the frets on the guitars. So wood like mahogany and ebony and rosewood.
So what's the company's response to these, it's not quite charges yet, but raids? What's the company saying?
Well, the company's actually been saying quite a lot since this last raid, and the CEO, Henry Juskowitz, has been on a number of TV programs. He's been interviewed by reporters all over the world, and he has argued very strongly that this is a case of government overreach, and that the government stormed into his factories and offices with armed agents, shut down business, and have yet to file a single charge.
And what has the Justice Department actually said beyond the raid?
They've said very little. They say that because there's an ongoing investigation, they're not able to comment. But we do know a little bit about their position from these ongoing civil cases, because when the government seizes your property, they have to go to court and go through a legal process of trying to obtain it. So the government's done that in the case of both of these raids in 2009 and again last August. In this 2009 raid, they said that Gibson deliberately altered customs forms to show that the wood they exported from India was legally exported, and then they altered them again to show that they were importing wood that complied with U.S. customs regulations.
So just to be clear, though, is Gibson saying that they didn't knowingly do it, or they just deny that there's anything illegal about the wood, or in fact that the wood comes from these places, India and Madagascar?
Well, what Gibson has said in both cases is that they have done their best. They've done due diligence to import wood that they believe is completely legal to bring into this country. And they've also cited sort of Indian and Madagascar law that they say proves that both those governments were totally okay with them exporting the wood.
I gather this has also raised some questions about a sort of fear about whether vintage guitars might be in violation somehow. It has some musicians worried about their old guitars.
Yeah, I think especially in Nashville, that sort of stirred up a lot of concern. People collect guitars here. People love guitars here. There may be more guitars per capita in Nashville than anywhere else on the globe. And I've talked to musicians, I've also talked to luthiers and vintage guitar dealers who are really concerned that because this Lacey Act requires them to document in a lot of detail the provenance of every single piece of wood on each guitar if they're shipping it out of the country or if they're traveling on tour, that they might show up at the airport one day and have their guitars seized. Now, the government has said very clearly, the Department of Justice has written a letter to concerned Tennessee congressmen saying that that is not what they intend to do.
And speaking of those congressmen, and you said this has stirred things up, tell us what's happening on the political front. What kind of fight has this provoked?
I think it's taken on a pretty interesting life of its own politically. The Tea Party has gotten involved. They feel like this is an issue of the government putting U.S. jobs in jeopardy by raiding a U.S. business, as well as citing a law that requires companies like Gibson to understand what foreign environmental laws are and to adhere to them. They held a rally here a couple of weeks ago in support of Gibson. The other thing that's happening is a couple of Tennessee congressmen, Marsha Blackburn, who's a Republican from a Nashville suburb called Brentwood, and Jim Cooper, who's a Democratic congressman who represents Nashville, just last week introduced an amendment to the Lacey Act, which is the law in question, the law that Gibson's being investigated under, that would protect vintage guitars, and it would make some changes to Lacey going forward.
So what's the next step? What are you watching for next?
I think it's probably going to get more interesting politically, because the Lacey Act is a law that environmentalists I've talked to, some of them have said that it's the most important piece of legislation, environmental legislation, that they have seen in their lifetime, or they expect to see in their lifetime, and they're really concerned that what's happening with Gibson will be a leverage to sort of undo all of these really hard-fought environmental victories. On the Gibson front, I really think the next thing to look for is indictments, whether they come through or not. That would be the next logical step for the Department of Justice.
And finally, I presume the rest of the industry is watching carefully as well, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's today in Congress, there's the Songwriter Caucus that's meeting, and this is going to be one of the things they talk about. It's been a big subject of discussion in Nashville in different gatherings of musicians and music industry folks. So yeah, I think people are really interested in keeping tabs on this.
All right, Anita Wadhwani of the Tennessean, thanks so much.
Thank you.